The war will end when the West will give up on trying to negotiate with Putin. The war will end when the West finally has the courage to do what is right. And what is right is to accept Ukraine into NATO and to extend security assurances to the territories Ukraine controls. Or, at the very least, these assurances should apply to the regions not listed in the Russian Federation's constitution as part of Russia, namely Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea. Those would remain occupied, similar to how East Germany or Poland was occupied under the Warsaw Pact. However, NATO security guarantees must apply to all the rest of Ukraine in the same manner as it was for West Germany. Ukraine has repeatedly proven its commitment to the values of democracy and human rights. It is a reliable ally. NATO would benefit significantly from Ukraine's membership versus being Ukraineless. Ukrainians cannot resist Russian invasion forever. Not accepting Ukraine into NATO would eventually allow Moscow to squash the will of Ukrainian people to resist, allowing Putin to exploit Ukraine's resources and to establish a new geographical foothold in Central Europe. Conquering Ukraine would allow Putin to have access to pro-Russian Hungary and pro-Russian Slovakia. It would allow him to devour Moldova and, as a result, to have a much greater impact in fear-mongering tactics targeted onto other EU members. Losing Ukraine would lead to fear and more pro-Russian governments being elected, which in return would lead to a disaster. By contrast, accepting Ukraine into NATO would bolster the security in the region and would strengthen the entire alliance, because we all have one enemy, and it's easier to fight it together, especially considering how much experience and courage Ukrainians bring to the table. The path forward is not easy. It requires decisive actions. It requires taking responsibility. But the victory will come not by force. Here's my 4-part peace plan. First, accept Ukraine into NATO. Second, crush Moscow Empire with sanctions. It's actually not that hard to do. One doesn't need to be a genius to see who is helping Kremlin bypass sanctions. Let me remind you that all of their missiles are made with Western components. Even their Oreshnik that made Joe Rogan pee his panties is made thanks to the Western tools.
That's insanity.
Fucking insanity.
Russia is a gas station not capable of producing anything of value on its own. So, crush them economically and crush anyone who is helping them bypass sanctions. And of course, stop funding the war yourselves. Countries in the European Union have enriched Putin's pockets for 212 billion euros since the invasion occurred. In fact, this is twice the amount that EU countries provided as aid for Ukraine. Such corruption of Western values is disgusting, to say the least. The EU regards human life as one of the highest values, but at the same time sponsors Putin, who is responsible for taking thousands of human lives each day. Such despicable hypocrisy must end, or else EU will end. Either you stand up for your values, or you give up on them. How can you compromise on your values? Third part of agreement is assure Moscow that Ukraine will not use force to reclaim occupied territories, but do provide Ukraine anything it needs to defend itself from any further Russian invasion. You cannot win this war by being a coward. When nuclear states like Soviet Union and United States were fighting on the Korean Peninsula, or when there was a proxy war in Vietnam, or the tank standoff in Berlin, or the Cuban crisis, or many other incidents that did not lead to nuclear war, precisely because the West had courage to do what is right. Imagine the world if United States would be a coward back in the Cold War era. We would live in a completely different world right now, and probably with nuclear consequences. But the enemy is still the same today as it was in the Cold War era. And the enemy is growing in strength thanks to the cowardness of the West.
We must maintain the strength to deter their aggression. But while we do so, we must not give up our effort to bring them into the world community of nations. Peace through strength as long as necessary.
History has proven that peace through strength is the only effective path to preventing the war. It must be very clearly communicated to the Russians. If you don't escalate, we will not escalate first as well. But if you dare attempt any type of escalation, any act of hostility towards the West, it would result in an imminent and far greater response. For example, if Russia sends 100 missiles, the West will respond with 400 missiles. If Russia cuts another internet cable, the West will find appropriate countermeasure and implement it immediately. If Russia produces another bullshit informational campaign against the West must take informational war seriously and respond accordingly. The West must have zero tolerance for any shape or form of hostility. This approach, speak softly and carry a big stick, has worked in the past, and there is no need to reinvent it. Other proposals for peace, like in peacekeepers in Ukraine and other middle ground solutions, are impractical. They do not guarantee peace. Diplomatic and friendly engagement with countries like India, Saudi Arabia should also be a part of the strategy. Relationship with China, the biggest strategic supporter of Russia, should be re-evaluated immediately as well. And fourth point, offer smart amnesty deals to Russian oligarchs and generals who defect from Putin. Allow them to have whatever penthouses and yachts they got in London, Italy, or Spain. We must encourage by all means possible the internal opposition within Moscow Empire to destabilize the regime. Putin, his generals, and his oligarchs do not want to die. They fear the consequences of nuclear retaliation, though they might pretend otherwise. Their society values toughness and views fear as weakness. But beneath their facade, they are all afraid, morbidly afraid.
Нет, я...
Или признавать суверенитет республики.
Я поддержу...
Говорите прямо.
Я поддержу предложение о признании...
Поддержу или поддерживаю? Говорите прямо, Сергей.
Поддерживаю предложение...
Так и скажите, да или нет.
Да? Поддерживаю предложение.
That's why they are so obedient in the first place. Such obedience to the tyrant comes not out of courage, it comes out of fear for their lives, fear to lose their wealth, and fear for well-being of their offspring. Which, by the way, most children of Russian oligarchs enjoy a lavish lifestyle in NATO countries. Here's why there could be no negotiations with Putin, as I mentioned in the very beginning of this video. His goals are the genocide of Ukrainian people, destruction of NATO,
Мы же понимаем, что наша цель СВО не закончится. Мы должны развалить НАТО. Нас это беспокоит.
and the subsequent restoration of Russia as an empire it once was. There is no middle ground for Russians here. Just acknowledging Ukraine's existence for them equals defeat, because their version of history does not have the Ukrainian nation in it.
People residing in that territory were allegedly not really Russians, but rather belonged to a special ethnic group, Ukrainians, started being propagated by the Austrian General Staff. In 1922, when the USSR was being established, the Bolsheviks started building the USSR and established the Soviet Ukraine, which had never existed before.
Right.
So in this sense, we have every reason to affirm that Ukraine is an artificial state. I say that Ukrainians are part of the one Russian people.
You've heard it well yourself during his short historical rumble to Tucker Carlson. I've actually debunked his lies in my video, so check it out. So, this war for Ukraine is existential. That's why no negotiations are possible here. It is absurd to assume that Ukrainians, or anyone else for that matter, can negotiate their inherent right to exist. This war is also existential for the survival of Moscow Empire. They are gambling right now everything on its survival, and they're ready to pay any price necessary. Let me repeat that again. They're ready to pay any price or die as an empire. They've put down 150,000 souls just to get a small piece of Finland. They have killed over hundreds of thousands of civilians just to squash the Chechens' people will to resist. They have put down hundreds of thousands of people just to get Berlin before Americans would. They have already put down more than 500,000 people in Ukraine alone. And they are ready to put down millions more if necessary. They're ready to sacrifice their economy, their prosperity. Do not underestimate their will to persist in their goals. For them, the amount of lives they lose does not matter. The Moscow Empire thrives on corruption, oppression, and the exploitation of its own people. Their soldiers are sent to die in the meat grinders, on scooters, on ladas, on bikes, on crutches, on monster Frankensteins, haphazardly remade in a garage. Their population is trapped in an empire-wide hypnosis that tells them to fight for this very system that oppresses them. Moscow Empire has engineered the social orbit of brainwashing people to be obedient, to trust the authority, not to ask critical questions, and to believe in the illusion of imperial glory. After all, this is all that population has, a sense of belonging to something great and powerful, even though that something great and powerful is a farce. People who call themselves Russians today fail to see that their lives would be more prosperous and more fulfilling without the empire that brings them only suffering and false promises. Living in the most richest country by natural resources, Russians are morbidly afraid to acknowledge that the defeat of their empire would bring positive changes to their lives. This is why there is no middle ground for them either. And this is precisely why no negotiations are possible. There is nothing to negotiate about on either side. It would be equivalent for Jewish people and the Nazis negotiating. When one side wants to genocide the other, what are the Jews supposed to be negotiating about? What are Ukrainians supposed to be negotiating about? This is absurd that the idea of negotiation on one's right to exist even comes into the minds of Western people. We can clearly see that in the recent Lex Friedman interview of Zelensky, how he thinks Zelensky is treating Putin too harsh.
I give the president every single chance to signal willingness to negotiate. I don't think he took it, and instead chose to speak very crude words towards Vladimir Putin.
That's the result of decadence. So either we stand for our values with no compromises, or we prepare ourselves for more violence in the future, more blood, and maybe even for nuclear winter. Because this is the path where corruption of Western values and fear to defend them ultimately leads. Accepting Ukraine to NATO, I think, is the last chance the West has to avoid World War III or any other disaster. Ukraine right now is holding thanks to basically repurposing racing FPV drones into weapons. Ukraine needs your help to resist this Zerg attacks now more than ever, especially considering Ukraine is now fighting North Korea. Please donate to this volunteer that I trust for FPV drone, Sergei Starnenko. Those FPV drones also shoot down Russian spy and kamikaze drones, thus literally saving lives. I will put the PayPal email of this volunteer in the description of this video. Right now we have weak leaders, and because they were elected by cowardly and ignorant public. As I see, the burden of preserving the free world, our values, lies on people like us, people who are not asleep, people who see history repeating. I myself have been investing into upholding Western values and highly encourage you to take action and contribute yourself. If you'd like to support me financially, I appreciate it much, but this time I would rather you choose to donate to Sternenko for FPV drones. Consider writing in a reference that you got inspired from Savage Sage YouTube channel, and that would mean a lot for me. Thank you so much for watching this video. My name is Yaroslav. I am from Ukraine. Let me know if you disagree or agree with my peace plan, or maybe you see any other way it could be improved. I look forward to reading your comments and hearing your opinion on this topic. Peace through strength, my friends, from now on onwards.
The Ukrainians are the ones doing all the fighting. It's a curious sort of European or really even world war where the stakes are global. The stakes have to do with China. They have to do with the international order. They have to do with nuclear proliferation. And the Ukrainians are doing it all. They're doing it all themselves. And all we have to do is provide material support. So we are not tired. We can talk ourselves into the idea that we're tired. Journalists can decide that they want to talk about something else, but we're not tired. We could support them indefinitely. They need our help to keep going. That's the critical question. They're the ones who are doing the suffering. I think what we have to do is make sure that we're doing the things we do well, like economic sanctions and the transfer of weapons, to make sure that not too many of them, and to put it very directly, have to die. There is a limit on the number of Ukrainians, but the war's not going to be over until pressure on Russia is sufficient to bring it to an end.